Hello, let's go over the sheep heart dissection. I do wish we could have dissected the sheep heart in lab, it just wasn't meant to be. This picture here I got off the internet, but just shows what it looked like if we were able to open up the sheep heart. Let's look at some of the structures on the outside of the heart, and then we're going to look at some structures that are on the inside of the heart. We're going to keep it simple. Okay, whenever you look at a heart, it's kind of a triangular shaped organ or pyramid shaped organ, which means there is a base, which is the flatter part of the organ, and then there's going to be an apex where it comes to a point. All right, the vessels, the blood vessels that are leading to the heart or away from the heart are basically located at the base. We have this blood vessel here coming from this chamber. This will be the pulmonary trunk. It's not labeled, and you don't need to worry about the ones that aren't labeled. And then we have this blood vessel right here, which is going to be the aorta, which is coming from this chamber that is right here. All right. If we look at the outer surface of the heart, some of the things we can see a bunch of fat, this adipose tissue on the outside as well. And you can also see some grooves on the surface of the heart. I want you to pay attention to this one right here. This is the anterior interventricular sulcus. Now we know we're looking at the anterior or ventral surface because that's what the label in the picture is. Since this is the anterior surface of the heart, that means the structures that are on your right are actually on the left side of the heart, and then these structures that are on your left are actually on the right side of the heart. If you can remember from lecture that the right side of the heart is conducting blood that is oxygen poor blood, and then the left side of the heart is carrying or transporting oxygen. It's pumping blood that is a higher oxygen content, so it's oxygen rich. Okay, if we look at this anterior interventricular sulcus that is right here, it separates the lower chambers, the ventricles, into the right ventricles and the left ventricle. So that makes this chamber right here that is pointing to is the right ventricle, and then this chamber over here is the left ventricle. The left ventricle is the largest of the chambers of the heart. It is so large it actually forms the apex as well, all the way down here. When the ventricles contract, they will contract at the same time, and they push blood up and into either the pulmonary circuit through the pulmonary trunk or into the systemic circuit through the aorta. The chambers that are the upper chambers, they are called atria. Singular is atrium, plural is atria. All right, we can see on the outside of the heart a flap that is called an auricle. Now this line is pointing to which chamber? It's pointing to the upper chamber, which is going to be the atrium. This is the left side of the heart, so this is the left atrium. Then if we go to the other side of the heart, this chamber, it's an upper chamber. It has an auricle that makes this an atrium, and this is the right side of the heart, so this is the right atrium. All right, now we're going to look inside of the heart. One of the first things we want to look for when we look inside of the heart is the left ventricle. The left ventricle is easy to spot because it is the chamber that has the thickest wall that surrounds it. The thicker the wall, the stronger the contraction. So whenever the left ventricle contracts, it pushes blood up into the aorta, which is going to be into your systemic circuit. All right, we're going to start at the very top right here with this valve. We're going to work our way around and label these different parts in a clockwise direction. This first valve right here, this first valve is showing right here between the left ventricle and the aorta, which would make this a semilunar valve. Semilunar valves are between the ventricle and the next blood vessel. So this is the aortic semilunar valve. All right, the next line is pointing to a chamber. This chamber is on the left side, and it's an upper chamber, so that would make this the left atrium. Okay, and then we continue down. After the left atrium, we go to this next valve. If we look closely at this picture, this valve has cords attached to it, which are called chordae tendineae. And the only valves that have chordae tendineae are the AV valves, also known as the atrioventricular valves. So this is the AV valve on the left side between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So this is going to be the bicuspid or mitral valve. That's what this line is pointing to. If we go to the line below it, This is pointing to the cords that are right here. These cords attach to the cusps of the AV valve and then the papillary muscle. These are called chordae tendineae. So this line is for the chordae tendineae. All right, then we come back down to this line right here. This line is pointing to the arrangement of the muscles in the floor of the ventricle. This special arrangement is called trabeculae carneae. So this line is pointing to the trabeculae carneae. Then we continue around. This line is asking for a chamber. It's pointing to this large chamber. So it's pointing to the left ventricle. All right, we go to the next line right here. This line is pointing to this wall. This wall separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle. This wall is called a septum. And since it is between the two ventricles, it is called the interventricular septum. That is this structure right here. Then we continue around this chamber. This line is pointing to this chamber. It's a lower chamber. The walls are thinner than on the left side, so this makes this the right ventricle. Then we continue up. This line is pointing to the muscle of the wall of the heart, whether it's in the atrium or the ventricle. It's easier to see in the ventricles because they're thicker. This will be the myocardium. And then we came back up, and then we see this valve. This is pointing to the valve between this chamber and this chamber. And there are cords. The chordae tendineae are attached to it, which would make this the AV valve on the right side. So this is the tricuspid valve. And then we continue up. The last one is pointing to this upper chamber. This is the right side of the heart. This is the right atrium. Okay, last slide. We're looking inside of the heart in an internal view, but now it's flipped. We're looking at the other side. So this is showing this really thick wall in this chamber. It's a lower chamber. It's a thick wall. So this is the left ventricle. All right, once we find the left ventricle, we can find everything else. So this chamber is pointing to the left ventricle. Then we go up. This line is pointing to these cords that are inside of the ventricle. This is the chordae tendineae. So if this is the chordae tendineae, if we go up one more line, this is for a valve. This is the left side of the heart. It's attached to the chordae tendineae, which means this is an AV valve. So that would make this the bicuspid or the mitral valve. All right, then we continue up. This chamber. This line is pointing to this chamber. If we can find the left ventricle, then we know the chamber above it right here would be the left atrium. All right, then we continue on around. This is pointing to a valve. Now this valve is between the left ventricle and this blood vessel. This blood vessel is going to be the aorta. This means this is a semilunar valve. This would be the aortic semilunar valve. All right, and then we continue down around. This valve, this line is pointing to this valve, which is attached to cords. The cords that are on the right side of the heart are attached to the tricuspid valve. So this is pointing to the tricuspid valve, and we go down to this chamber. This is a lower chamber. It's a thinner wall, which means this is the right ventricle. Then we go down to this line. This is pointing to this really thick wall that separates the left and the right ventricle. This would be the interventricular septum. And then we go to this line. This line's a little tricky. It's pointing inside of the ventricles. It's not pointing to the trabeculae carneae, which we would have thought if we were looking at the previous slide. You'll notice that this is a smooth wall compared to the trabeculae carneae. So this is a muscle. This muscle is attached to cords, which then are attached to the AV valve. So that would make this the papillary muscle. All right, so we have papillary muscles. The papillary muscles are real important. They're going to contract at the same time as the myocardium of the ventricles. And whenever the papillary muscles contract, they pull on the chordae tendineae, and they keep the AV valves closed, so that whenever the ventricles contract, they prevents blood from going backwards up into the atrium, and instead it goes into the pulmonary or the systemic circuit, depending on whether it's the right or the left side. So if we look at the left side of the heart right here, this papillary muscle, when it contracts, that means the left ventricle is also contracting, pulls on the chordae tendineae on the left-hand side, and it keeps the bicuspid or mitral valve closed so that the blood only goes through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta.